exchange knowledge on changes in London and linking them to the LSE research programme. The aim is to create some partnerships amongst significant London stakeholders and to show how research and practice in London links to cities across the world. And we've got 3 speakers tonight who do all of those things. So the way the session is going to be run is we've got 3 10-minute presentations, and then following that with a discussion with you guys. You've also got a chance for some feedback, because you've all got those. I'm instructed by Tony to mark on them, and I'll remind you later on. Before I introduce the speakers, I'll just say a little bit about me and why I think this is a particularly interesting subject. I've spent over 35 years working in housing in London, including working in a local authority, several housing associations of different sizes and at different times. I was in a workers' collective supporting housing cooperatives, which was interesting. And I also led the master planning process of a Housing Action Trust, which some of you will remember, but quite a few of you might not. And these were things that the government set up to tackle poor quality local authority estates, and I didn't want to our hands. I've lived in London for longer than that, for over 40 years, and during that time I've lived in student accommodation, short life housing, which was something again that those who are a little older in the audience will recollect, and council housing, and then as an owner-occupier. And in the late 1970s, you could queue up for a home as a Greater London Council, which was a bit like the GLA, we actually owned housing and other things and could do more. They couldn't let their housing, so you could just queue up and get, in my case, a rather delightful one-bedroom mobility flat, customer block of flats in Greenwich. It was fine. So we've gone from a position post-war of housing surplus to now being in a position where we've got a very significant housing crisis. And we've got a lot of people living in housing that's costing them too much. And we've got huge growth in the private rented sector. I think the private rented sector now exceeds social housing sector, which is just extraordinary, because when I went into housing in London, the private rented sector was about 1%. It's now, I don't know, I'm looking at the facts, I've got some of about 30, is it about 30% now? It's just extraordinary. And the private rented sector is often poor quality and overcrowded. We've had issues about the quality of London's homes. Oh, probably always happened from Roman times onwards. But certainly from the Second World War onwards, mainly we've had issues about quality. And it's really only in the last 30 years that we've got into an issue about enough places for people to live in. And it wasn't until the early noughties that actually exceeded the population that London had pre-war. So we can't provide people becomes not even a home at all. So we all know that cost of sleeping is growing, owner occupation is too expensive for a significant proportion of those looking for a home, and disrepair is high in the owner-occupied sector. If you want social housing, whether it's council housing or housing association housing, you have to have very significant needs, and even then you will wait an awful long time before you get a home. So more people are living in the growing private rented sector, often in overcrowded and poor quality housing, and even where it's good quality, it's often expensive and insecure. So if you are at the younger age group and you're renting, the likelihood is, if you could find a way to buy, you would be paying less. And of course, the way the government is spending most of its capital programme is on Help to Buy, which you can decide whether you like or you don't. So the development of, the opportunity for Londoners to really have much of a say in where they live and the quality of what they live in, to be able to affect their housing choices and engage proactively, not just around their own home, but the neighbourhood in which they live in, is really, really limited at the moment. If you are and younger people trying to buy a place, and you take the government shilling the help to buy, who wouldn't? You're going to live in flats. They're probably very dense, and then some of them will be very high rise, and that might be fine, but you're quite constrained in the choices that you make. So, having been involved in a number of housing roles over the years, it has always seemed to me that where tenants, where the residents have been able to play more of a role in shaping their homes and in their broader environment, they almost always, that means to better places that are going to last longer. You know, whether it's local authority tenants, on the state regeneration, or housing co-ops, or various models, you land up with something that's more satisfactory. So in that context, the growth of things like cohousing, community land trusts, the opportunity for people to really do something about their own housing needs and to live somewhere that's nice and with a range of different housing and tenures and typologies in the area, in the place that they're living, seems to be fantastic. And if you add on to that the opportunity for community space and potentially workspaces and other things in good landscape, then it becomes something that we should look at, not as a solution to the housing crisis, but as another way of helping people get into much needed homes. So that's what we're going to talk about this evening. And we've got three experts here tonight, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about all three of them before they speak, because then we can just get on with it. So, first speaker is Melissa Fernandez, Dr. Melissa Fernandez, and she's an urban sociologist, a lecturer in urban futures at the University of Lancaster. She has a background in international development, women's studies and philosophy. Her work has focused primarily on housing issues, drawing on the twin framework of homemaking and unmaking, which I think is a really interesting concept, with a feminist slant. And she's pursued a range of questions around urban dispossession and exclusion in the UK, Europe, Latin America, South Asia, and the Caribbean. But over the past 7 years, she's been researching and writing about the production of alternative, collaborative, community-led practices, notably senior co-housing schemes. And there's some very interesting approach to how you cope with getting older, which is something that is interesting me hugely at the moment. And this is including looking at the social and community life of new senior co-housing, mostly in the UK, but also in Holland and the US. And that sounds fantastic. And then Zora Chiang, behind me, who's an architect and who works in regeneration at Croydon Council. And she's driven by a desire to create great places to live through high-quality design and involvement of the community. Before she joined Croydon, she worked at Levitt Bernstein, who are fantastic architects, and she developed a particular expertise in technical design and modular construction. She's Croydon's strategic lead for community-led housing and chairs GLA's London Community-Led Housing Hub, which she helped to set up. And she's also an experienced Housing Association board member and likes to promote change through collaborative working. And finally, we have Gabrielle Neves de Lima, and she's a research assistant at the Geography and Environment Department at the LSE, and is the author of this, which you've got, I think, in front of you. She's got a background in political science and urban policy. Her current research at the LSE looks at community land trusts in London, looks at housing justice, the land question, and collective action, with a focus on women's perspectives and experiences. So we've got a great lineup and an opportunity to ask questions and discuss some really interesting approaches to housing. So.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming. Right. So I'm just going to kind of delve into it and answer the question that was posed today, which is whether alternative housing can ease the crisis. And I was really happy that this wasn't framed as solving the crisis, which is usually the kind of terminology that's used, because I think that yes, definitely alternative housing from a sociological perspective, which is kind of where I'm coming from, can help make the crisis less severe. But obviously, this is a very niche subsector, and it's not the answer, and I'm not claiming that it's the answer. It's one of many things that need to be happening at the same time, concurrently, as part of a much wider political and economic program and social program that doesn't focus just on supply, but that is looking at the things that were being mentioned about access to that supply and the conditions under which that supply is granted. So I'm going to address this question specifically through co-housing, which is the bit that I have a bit more of expertise on in terms of alternative housing. But I wanted to define it first because there's a lot of confusion around what it means, how it fits into the larger kind of collaborative housing framework, if you will. And I think that in doing so, it's kind of alleviating characteristics will start to become apparent. So at the moment, there's this range of alternative housing options that are kind of buzzing out there, and we have kind of technical options like prefab modular building, which is great. You have more controversial options, perhaps, of so-called co-living, like the Collective, and I've quoted here how they kind of sell themselves as a form of co-living. But really, these are designed and they're managed by for-profit companies, private companies specialized in house sharing for what is the so-called nomad digital generation. So it's a very specific kind of product with a very specific kind of clientele. It's almost student-like accommodation, very small rented accommodation. So co-housing is not that, so I wanted to clarify. Instead, it's part of this much broader umbrella, if you will, of self-organized forms of housing provision that encompass all these and more forms of self-organized housing. So co-ops, we're going to hear about CLTs, squats as a kind of informal mode of self-organizing. And there's a recent article by McGregor and Soomers, and I've included a slide that if this goes online afterwards, you can check the references, where they talk about co-housing specifically as a form of commoning. Co-housing has been described as commoning before, but what they're saying is that it plays this pivotal role, and I quote, in strategies for overcoming the vagaries of neoliberalism and visions of transition to a post-capitalist society, and that it represents an ongoing process of people coming together to create environments that they want to inhabit when the state and the market fail to deliver. So already it's kind of pointing towards this alternative to market failure, and very much a kind of resident-led alternative, a citizen-led alternative. So co-housing is very much a plural phenomenon. It's very difficult to define exactly what it is because it has a vast range of ideologies that motivate it. It varies across countries, it varies within countries, but it does have a few key common elements, which are first and foremost this residential engagement with all the stages of provision. So this is from the design to the planning to the development to the maintenance. So pre and post move-in. This again may vary in emphasis between groups. It's typically, but not always, co-designed with architects. So this is seen as kind of key to the way that residents play a role in the kinds of spaces that they want to live in because they're co-designing it with the designers. But of course, not everybody that lives in co-housing in different stages of the life of co-housing will have designed that initially. But that's kind of the idea. It can be intergenerational, it can be age-specific. I've been looking at senior-specific co-housing groups. It can be single or mixed tenure. There's a kind of misconception out there that co-housing is really a kind of middle-class enclave. Some maybe. But there is in a sense that it's also mixed tenure, and there are many groups that are actually mixed tenure. It can be community-led, so that's the kind of that's the umbrella that in the UK is called community-led housing. That's resident-led versus developer-led. So you can have non-profit agencies, you can have housing associations or other kinds of midway developers that are leading the development, and that's known as collaborative housing. Like I said, motivations and ideologies may vary, and there are a range of noted benefits, and I'm going to talk about that anyway in a moment. So in terms of answering the question, I think perhaps most straightforwardly, Yes, we know that from a kind of supply side, producing more of these projects will add numbers. It will yield more housing. But I think what's interesting about cohousing is not so much that, since we know it's very niche and actually the numbers are very small, but that it provides a wide variety and range of housing that responds directly to what people want. So it's categorically a very different kind of housing to what large-scale volume builders offer us today. What we know also, unfortunately, is that in the UK, compared to other kind of mixed market economies like Germany, France, and Scandinavian countries, it's very late and very slow in delivering a very modest amount of supply of community housing. Financially, it can provide long-term housing affordability through things like alternative forms of ownership. It can limit the return that an individual can make upon the resale in a way that traditional markets can't. These are mechanisms that the individual groups will decide themselves whether they want to pursue or not, but they can help low or moderate income families build equity. Like I said, there's mixed tenure groups as well, and those can provide, for sure, a kind of more socially sustainable form of social housing. The problem in London with providing mixed tenure, of course, one of the biggest challenges is that many groups have that intention, but as soon as they hit the problem of land supply, the problem of land cost, the many and multiple planning obstacles, they have to drop that element in order to make the project a success. So they end up with a much less diverse project than they would have initially intended to. Beyond the kind of broader project, there's also this internal collaborative economy that happens with a lot of the co-housing groups, which can yield a more affordable cost of living. So things like shared food, shared utilities, shared goods and services. Groups sometimes have shared pots of fundings to help neighbors out when there are personal emergencies, when there's moments where they can't cover the rent. So there's mutual aid financially as well. Now, at the global level, looking kind of outside the UK, many co-housing communities often perform better, not just in these economic terms that I've been talking about, but also, of course, ecologically, much more so than conventional speculative owner-occupied housing. And so they help to reduce energy demand, waste, and consumption. These are just some of the things that in terms of sustainability, they can do. They have, as I mentioned, social collaborative arrangements. This has been coined by Helen Jarvis as the soft architecture of co-housing. And that happens internally to foster a kind of shared know-how of practices in the community and practices of how the building works. And that actually makes a huge difference in terms of future maintenance costs and how residents can take over the maintenance of their built environment. And I kind of wanted to put this here because we're seeing the language of shared living and urban villages being taken up, you could say co-opted, but it's definitely being used by enormous global companies like IKEA that are trying to design potential solutions for much bigger problems of rapid urbanization, questions of loneliness, and the growing global affordable housing crisis. What I'm increasingly interested in, and that's based on my work with the older women's co-housing group, is how co-housing is also linked to a crisis of care. And I realized I put this picture here, which is actually not the older women's co-housing group. This is the Featherstone co-housing group that I studied over 7 years as they were developing, and that group is actually not happening after 8 years of development. And that has to do with a breakdown in the relationship with the housing association and costs and so forth, which is part of the problem of developing co-housing in London. But in terms of linking co-housing with a crisis of care or social reproduction, what groups like OUCH, the Older Women's Co-housing, which is the first senior co-housing group in the whole of the UK, inaugurated in 2016, what they were trying to do is prevent dependence on family members or other intermediary options like assisted living or extra care. And the idea is that through these forms of mutual aid, very socially connected communities, internal connected communities, that they're going to provide an alternative to traditional discourses and practices of aging, or what we think about as aging home and family, in later life. And what they say is that they offer less tangible social benefits for the members, but also for society at large. So there's increased well-being for the members of the community, but also a reduction of public costs, presumably. That hasn't really been proven by evidence we've been trying to pursue that in our research. I see I have a minute, so I'm going to rush. So what I wanted to say is that if the crisis that we're referring to, I'm trying to think about crisis more broadly, if it's connected to a crisis of care, if it's connected to a crisis of social reproduction, to a crisis of affordability, the environment, then cohousing, I think, can be understood as a kind of multi-level response to that very complex reality. And when planners or local authorities learn from the cohousing development process and experience, and they do things like integrate social sustainability and notions of cooperation into, for instance, criteria for developer competitions, then this very intense lived value of dwelling is officially recognized and is going to enter the mainstream in a way that counters or at least challenges traditional speculative economic valuations of housing. I had a whole other thing about the problems, but I don't have any more time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you. Oh.
Thanks. Hi. Yeah, I was going to say just thanks to Phil, who is my research partner, and I'm indebted to him for some of the slides in this. So thanks. Yeah, and some of this work is a bit about my journey moving from architecture, pure architecture, to working for the council, working as a regeneration manager. Phil and I have been researching for a number of years, and we call ourselves Appropriate Housing. Phil's also an architect at Cullinan's, but basically we came to a combination of sort of 3 or 4 years of research in summer, and we both just sort of had enough of pure architecture, and I went to work for the council, and now he's doing a PhD. So. Yeah, so when I was asked about this, and it's about kind of alternative housing easing the crisis, for me, the real crisis is about security of tenure. So it's not necessarily about ownership, but people, I rented in London for, 7 years, lived in 9 places. Just, I know that you're constantly packing up, you've hardly put your posters on the wall, you're just on to the next place, and it is a complete nightmare. And that's just what we have in this country because we haven't got rental control or in kind of long tenancies, and I think that's our real crisis here. So, and sort of this is the kind of classic simple problem of how it's described in the media at the moment. It's like, well, house prices are really high. They used to be quite so high, and the reason they used to be so high is because we built way more houses. And that's a really simple problem, and then it's a simple solution, isn't it? Let's all just build way more houses, and then surely the prices will fall. And you've got the SHLA, which is the kind of the document that the mayor produces to tell us how many more homes we need to build each year. And as a local authority, you look at that and you're like, geez, where are these all going to go? And yeah, it's thousands and thousands of homes, and apparently we need 55% one beds. I don't know how many people live in a one bed, but not necessarily so flexible for the rest of your life. So let's build more houses, and it's war spirit, war on crime, war on terror, let's war on this housing supply shortage. It sounds easy, but it's a little bit more complicated than the supply issue, and I just kind of very kind of, trying to explain it in sort of very brief terms, but essentially it's to do with interest rates. A lot of it's to do with interest rates. So we had, Phil and I developed this diagram where we talked about the fact that if you have £1,000 to spend on your housing costs, in 1998 you could go to the bank and say, here's £1,000 a month, what can I borrow? And they'd say about 110,000. So you'd go out and buy a house for 110,000. But now you can go to the bank with your £1,000 a month and borrow far more. So it's 235,000. You're like, yes, like twice as much house. But no, everybody else can borrow twice as much as well. So basically the same house is costing twice as much, more than twice as much, and mostly all of that money has gone into the land value. And that's, we can say as architects, we're certainly not really getting paid anymore. We're not really spending any much more on build costs. And this is a big simplification, but it's mainly, a lot of it's going into the land value. We actually did this. So the chap who runs Pocket Living, I live in a Pocket Living flat. We used my Pocket flat as the kind of breakdown example here. So I live in a 37 square metre one bed. I was very lucky because it's a Pocket flat. It's run at a discount. But if it wasn't at the discount, it would be sort of equivalent to our 235k house here. So about 235k. If you work out typical build costs, about 80k per flat. Probably Mark would argue with me on how much profit he's taking on this, but about 47, that's the sort of typical level of developer profit. That actually leaves like 108k is going to the land. And I don't know whether you guys, maybe you already knew this, but as architects, when we started breaking it down like this, we were just like, what, is this right? We're sort of tinkering away, working out how to build things cheaper and shave load off our fees and everything, and realistically, we're kind of missing the bigger picture here. So, yeah. So that's sort of land. We've also got this sort of subsidy imbalance. So this slide talks about the fact that the government has really changed its policies hugely since the 70s. There used to be much more investment, and no, June spoke about this at the beginning, in supply side subsidies, so that'd be council housing, mortgage interest relief, that kind of thing. Whereas now, if you kind of go through to now, we're spending much more on demand side subsidies, so that's help to buy, stamp duty relief, housing benefit going to private landlords, right to buy, and that's all actually really inflating our house prices as well as the sort of land. So is there a solution, or is there some sort of way of easing this? I think community-led housing could be a way. So what we're doing, I'm going to talk to you a bit about what different types of community-led housing there is, seeing how much time I've got, and then what Croydon are doing. So Croydon have, when I got a job there, like, oh, you know about community-led housing. Yes, our political people are talking about this a lot. We need to have some sort of strategic approach. I don't think anyone knew anything about it. So I was like, oh, okay, great. Just sort of designing the policy as soon as I got there. But we're already putting some sites up, which is really exciting. So community-led housing, Melissa's already sort of gone into this, but for us in the council, the key tenets of what actually the sort of definition of it is, it has to have meaningful community engagement, and the community has to then own or manage or steward the homes, so it can be rental homes. And then the key probably one for us is that the benefits of the scheme are legally protected in perpetuity. So if we're going to be supporting this kind of homes, we want to make sure that they're not going to then be sold in sort of 5 or 10 years' time on the private market. So community land trust is one type. I think the other speaker's speaking more about these, so I'll just kind of go through community land trusts. There's one recent one in St Clement's, which is 32 homes. I think that's the biggest one in London at the moment. Co-housing, Melissa's spoken about. Another exciting thing for architects is the co-design process that's involved in co-housing. This is the Nightingale model in Australia. If you don't know them, just look them up. It's really exciting. It's kind of data-led design. Developer-enabled, that's where developers help community groups get things moving. This is the approach that we're taking in Croydon. For us, it's about de-risking the process for us as a public body. You know, Featherstone have taken 8 years to get to actually nowhere, and we don't want to see our publicly owned sites, which we could be doing in affordable housing, you know, ourselves, fall away because we're letting a community group think about it for 8 years. So we've decided to, we're deciding to use our in-house developer to help support community groups. Another thing that we're looking at in Croydon is whether or not maybe some of our estate regeneration would be resident-led, and that's sort of a real genuine engagement of the community. And architects always do resident engagement, which is sort of go down, present what you've already drawn, and then hope they like it. But I think trying to really involve people and be really honest about what you're doing in terms of viability. I was speaking to someone yesterday actually at Montague Evans, who's working with Newham Council and Peach are a community group. They're doing a whole massive redevelopment, and they're having Montague Evans come down and talk to them about viability, about land values, about build costs, being really honest. And I think that's a really exciting approach, like genuinely, you know, respecting people's opinion of their area, but saying we need to be, you know, realistic about what we're trying to do here. So just a bit, I think I might finish on this one. So as a local authority, we've got our in-house developer, which are called Brick by Brick. They're doing a lot of small infill sites around the area. They're employing really exciting architects and doing some great stuff. And we're partnering with them on the community-led housing programme. So they are supporting us on up to 5 sites this year. But from a local authority, there's so we're giving this supply-side subsidy of discounted land. So what are we getting in return for it? And this is sort of the slide that I was showing them in the council to convince them, not that they needed much convincing, but genuine resident engagement. We've got a whole preventative agenda about people. The most expensive thing for councils is people who end up homeless, families who present to us who need temporary accommodation, and then there's all sorts of multiple services that need to help them with, young offending, kids going into care, all sorts of things that are associated with people, and if you could just make sure that they don't become homeless, or you can give them, positive housing, you're saving so much money in other sectors. It's great for our reputation. We get hopefully high quality housing and really building community resilience. So we're trying to tackle some of the challenges in terms of the risk and the kind of perceived resource issue through the support of Brick by Brick, because they're kind of really providing that kind of professional, they're going to stick to the programme, they're going to make sure that we're delivering on time and on budget, and tackling that development expertise gap. So yeah, that's them. And that's our first site, which is it's out already for bidding. So.
Do I have to speak on this? Hello. So I haven't prepared a presentation because all of you have a little booklet in front of you, and it's more detailed than any sort of PowerPoint. And just to start with, I wanted to get a sense of whether anyone here knows what a community land trust is. Like, if you could raise your hand just for me to have a sense. Okay, and have any of you participated in a community land trust or are a member of a community land trust or... Okay, I would like to ask if you could tell me, how do you think the community land trust can help ease the crisis? In a couple of words, if possible. Yeah, Jim?
Okay, I'm a member of Russ Community Land Trust in Lewisham, which you know. How can it help ease the crisis? I see it personally as a chance in perpetuity to take land out of the market. In terms, as has already been said, how it will have very little impact on the current housing crisis, but in the longer term, it will protect land ownership from the market.
Okay, and would you like to say something?
No, I agree. That's why we're, so there's 3 tenets of community-led housing. The perpetuity protection is really important to us. We're still sort of looking at right to buy implications, because that's sort of an area of policy which is still being discussed. Are community-led housing organisations insulated from right to buy? It's not really been tested yet. We hope so. But if they're going to provide truly affordable homes, as in social rent homes, council homes, and then they have to be registered providers, and registered providers fall under similar legislation to right to buy. So if it's genuinely in perpetuity, it's fabulous, but in this country I think we still need to sort of iron out some of the legislation.
Okay. Well, thank you. So this gives me a good place to start, because actually I was going to answer this question saying that community land trusts can help ease the crisis, because they fundamentally try to change our relation to land and the relation between finance and land, because we currently are in a system where finance is completely addicted to land. And there is a lot of work done on this. This is not my specialty, but there is an economist at UCL called Josh Ryan Collins that works on this housing finance feedback cycle. And Zora mentioned this before, but actually land accounts for 80% of the increase of housing prices in advanced economies since the 1950s. So this is a lot of money that just goes into land, not into construction costs or anything of the type. So securing land and controlling land is extremely important and a fundamental way of addressing the housing crisis. Here, I would like to just talk briefly about what got me interested in CLTs, and something that I think by participating in many CLTs here and in conferences is something that gets a bit lost. So the CLT model originated in the civil rights movement in the US. And it was not set in stone in one particular go. It would develop through time. But the key aspect of it, it's self-determination of African American population in the US, because especially in the South, where there was segregation and people were constantly removed from their lands, or they were prevented from voting as well, and this was very tied to land. And so the CLT model was a way for allowing people to have the right to housing, have the right to economic subsistence, and it's been used in diverse ways in many different places around the world. And I actually got to learn about community land trust because of the Chicago Anti-Eviction campaign, which is in Chicago. And it started out as an effort to prevent eviction, and because of the demolition of council estates due to a program called Hope 6. And later on, because the public housing was demolished, it was used in order to do what they called home liberations, which was basically to get homes that were foreclosed and that were empty and put homeless people who had suffered from foreclosure into those homes, as well as fighting in court. And what they noticed, though, was that in order to secure this what they had done, they had to have control of land, otherwise they would just lose it again and again. And so basically the community land trust is there for that, because unless we are able to redefine our relationship to land and who controls land, we are constantly going to have to keep on fighting the same problems, and we're going to constantly have housing crisis. And I think that in the UK, it's quite an incipient model. It started more in rural areas, and in urban areas, it's a particularly difficult model to push for, because in places such as London, land is extremely valuable. And so there are two examples that I can speak of that are trying to create a community land trust in large sites, which is in Camley Street in Camden, and in Haringey, so it's in the St. Anne's site. So far, they're still negotiating, but the ownership of land is a real question, because, for example, in Haringey, in the St. Anne's site, the land was bought by the GLA from the NHS for 50 million, and there is no community group that has this amount of money. And you also have small site policy. So the small site policy is quite a new thing, and it's aiming at delivering at least 25% of the housing targets through small sites. And we have one example that kind of was a precursor to the policy, which is Russ in Southeast London, Lewisham. And it's a very innovative model. And Zora mentioned this before, but CLTs can also be used as a community-led council estate regeneration. And there is a historical example. Although they did not call themselves a community land trust in the past, they kind of function as a community land trust, which is Walterton and Elgin community homes, exactly, in Westminster. And it's fascinating what they have done, because they have allowed for the people who were there to continue living there, and for those homes to be still affordable for similar households. And they actually managed to prevent those two council estates from being completely privatized. And there's a similar struggle going on in Hammersmith and Fulham, and these are the West Ken and Gibbs Green community homes, and the fight is really, really long. It's been 10 years, I think. So there are real possibilities with the CLT model. Community groups are coming up with all of these different ways of working with it, but they are encountering really big challenges, especially in London, because they fundamentally want to change land relations, and in London this is particularly difficult. And so if you have any further questions.
answer your questions. But if we start talking to you quietly, you just let us know. So we've got about 25, 26 minutes in which to have a conversation about this issue. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions at one time. And when you ask a question, can you say who you are, where you come from, and can you resist making a speech? If you do make a speech, I will stop you. So, gentlemen here.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, like that. I'm very happy to work at RC. But one of the serious problems that
Can you say who you are to start with?
yes, I'm a visiting professor here at RC. The price is very high. I think that for staff, 1 month is 1,500. Not for student, it's around the same price. A small room. Yes, it's like that. And I couldn't understand why the UK, as you said, that follow kind of policy push to own rather than rent policy. As for the co-housing and community-led housing and the trust, I think that is much as you try to control the price. My question is that what role for the government to play in this scams? Thank you. It's like that. I think that Singapore is the follow kind of government model. They control the price successfully. The price that you said that is that twice as 10 years ago, because I think more than that.
20 years.
Even 10 years, 12 years ago, I have a room in central London about 700. Now, even I think much smaller than that one, 1,500.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is, first of all, you don't really understand why we push.
It's the government, the role for the government.
Yeah. So first of all, you're saying you don't know really why the government pushes home ownership rather than rent, and what role could the government play to promote community-led housing? That's great. Can I have another question? Yes, sir.
One way promotion.
Can you say who you are?
Yeah, my name is Olivia Conbury. I'm a planning and built environment professional. One way promotion is to allocate an incentive to say, 10% or 20% of the total 10-year types on larger sites. An alternative could be, rather than having, say, a percentage, is to set certain standards for the site around design, social outcomes, environmental outcomes, that might perhaps favour some of these other kinds of tenures. So, including long-term stewardship, high environmental standards, might just by default make these 10 years easier to access those sites, and that perhaps would deter some of the financial models of some volume builders.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm going to take one more from those right at the back. I'll come to you next time.
Hi, my name's Gabriel. I actually work for myself as an independent consultant, a planning consultant. I've actually got a client who's kind of keen to push the co-living concept in the UK. It's more fast-moving in Europe and probably Germany actually, it's probably more readily promoted. But my thoughts are, as an alternative housing model, what are your thoughts on co-living? Because I know that hasn't quite come up in this talk. Slightly different. But I think for me, the biggest frustration is knowing that co-living as a product in the planning system kind of comes across as a sui generis use as opposed to housing, which means that it doesn't really tick any statutory housing targets. So my thoughts are, what are the solutions to the future? Could that be an alternative housing model? I think the problem we've got at the moment is because it's not self-contained, people are seeing it as a disbenefit, but it's not, because despite the fact you may have smaller living quarters, you've got the larger sociability of the wider space, and there are wider benefits. But it's about probably trying to re-educate people in understanding that it may not be self-contained, but that doesn't make it necessarily worse. And with a build-to-rent product, it still could be a positive. So I just wondered your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, I think should we do that one first? Melissa, you can talk a little bit about it.
Probably more critical. Co-living. I suppose, just to say one thing, is that, as you mentioned, yes, it kind of promotes greater sociability within the context of the project. One of the areas that is highlighted as potentially problematic is that it doesn't really then connect to its wider environment. And so these activities that it fosters are very kind of insular, if you will. And if we're talking about making these kind of urban villages, if you will, like Kia was talking about it, and connecting to wider crises, then I think co-living lacks in some respects. And I think one of the issues that perhaps you can speak to is also the cost for the size. Right? So this is actually very accessible to a very large segment of the population. So even if you replicate it, you are looking especially for us in the government to help out in some way.
Yeah, so I used to work at Levitt Bernstein, and there's a woman, Julia Park, who's got a lot to say about this sort of thing in terms of space standards. But just a few points are, going back to my land values thing, if you're going to be, so just to talk about space standards for a moment, co-living, there's examples in London where they've got sort of 13 square metre living room. It's like smaller than where I had my student halls. You know, you sit in your bed and you can use a microwave. I mean, does everybody want that?
They roll off the back of like alternative uses, so they will push through to a different way. I do agree.
Yeah, so there's some. I'm not even just only talking about office to resi conversions. I've been to the Collective. They're very high quality, but they're tiny. And so if you're going to be saying, so it might be all very well when you're in your early 20s and you're at university. How are you then going to make sure that nobody gets married, brings that person in there, has a kid? You know, you can't kind of.
It's not geared up for that. It's geared up for a certain place in time. And I think that's the key.
But I just think if we're building cities and we're thinking about building buildings for the future, is this just like sticking a plaster on a wound? Like it's just kind of providing an immediate like need for those exact people there. But it's not really thinking about. It's not being realistic about like the long term of what we're creating in our cities, and it's really pushing up land values. So if they can charge £1,000, and they are £1,000 a month, and maybe they do your laundry, but I bloody hope so for £1,000 a month, for a 13 square metre thing, then how many can they fit on a? You know, it's just that's exacerbating the problem so much by pushing up land values. I really am. I'm so against them. I'm really sorry.
I think that the person that I'm working with isn't thinking on the lines of, as you saying, like being stingy in terms of space. We're actually looking at being more generous, actually.
Well, then do the proper space standards and apply for planning permission, or negotiate an appropriate deal like Pocket Living have, where it's 37 square metre, one bed, one person. Clearly, they can't guarantee that we're not going to be families in there.
There are different.
Okay, hold on. After the do contract. I think you've got a sense of what people feel. So the next one was why is it why does government just push home ownership rather than rent? And what role could the government play to promote community-led housing? Well, we could spend the rest of the seminar talking about this one, but we won't. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, so I think government should take community, for example, community land trust much more seriously, and not circumscribe it to a niche type of housing, because I feel like this is what's happening in London, where it's being catered to the small size policy. And I actually have a quote from a representative of the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, which I thought was quite surprising. He said this in a conference in the beginning of the month, which is the community-led approach will take the most difficult, awkward, expensive, ridiculous sites, which other developers are not interested in, because that is where people want housing, and not because where you can make most profit. So I thought this was interesting because it kind of creates this whole new market in which CLTs can have land in that market and develop in that market, but they are going to have to use a lot of voluntary labor from its members. They're going to have to use a lot of pro bono and discounted advice from supporters and consultants, whereas we can keep the big developers having the big sites. So I think that government really has to take it the model seriously and allow for it to be used for larger scale development. And from the research I have done, it's only through large scale development that the CLT will allow for housing to be truly affordable. And there is actually one CLT that has tried to provide all rented housing, and it's Brixton Green. It's not like materialized because it was a bit too radical, but yeah. So government should play a bigger role, and it has played a bigger role in other contexts, such as in the US in some places, in France. In France, the government created the CLT model actually, and it's playing a bigger role in Belgium as well. So definitely has to play a bigger role. It's not.
I'm afraid just
You're going to have to say who you are.
I'm Mark Blessing, I'm Chief Executive Pocket. I'm delighted that we have somebody living one of the buildings. This is not a speech, this is just a factual representation of the land value. The average pocket flat in London is £250,000, and that represents a 20% discount to the ordinary first-time buyer one-bedroom home in London, which is somewhere around £320,000. The land value component of that is £50,000. Okay? The build component of that is £120,000, and the financing costs and professional fee costs is not £50,000. The profit we make on this average pocket flat is around £30,000. I wish it was £48,000. Land value is a real problem in London, undoubtedly. Family housing, by the way, has an average land value of £120,000. But it is not the barrier to trade that you're making it out to be. It's a significant barrier, but it's not the ultimate barrier. The real barrier to trade that we've got is a combination of land value and construction costs, which, and this is absolutely extraordinary to me, I have compared the cost of a pocket building in London to the cost of a pocket building in Berlin and Amsterdam. And I can assure you that the professionals I've worked there, their construction costs are 20 to 30% below ours. I cannot for the life of me work out why that is. So construction cost is a very pernicious problem in this whole debate. So don't just stare at land value.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to take the last question that was asked, which is the role of the middle one. Can we use the planning system by requiring percentages of different types of housing, or by upping the requirements, environmental requirements in particular? Is that going to help more housing, co-ownership, community land trusts, etc.?
It could do. It's something that we're looking at in terms of our local plan review, whether we can think about whether, I think the question that was asking about social outcomes, design standards, other kind of quality-based assessments. I think it could be quite unpopular. I think there's constant calls in this country for planning deregulation, and putting additional standards on, probably going to increase build costs. I don't know how popular that would be. It's an interesting one. It also then gives quite a lot of power to planners who do have quite a bit of power already, and I think we need to make sure that that's properly democratic. The more I'm getting into working for a local authority, the more I'm finding the planning system in this country quite strange with the councillors.
I think you think about things differently. If you're going to sell it in 6 months, or if you're going to own it for the next 50 years.
You're dead right.
And I think you're more willing to invest in spending a lot of money on design and quality and understand if you're going to hang on to it, compared to if you're going to flog it as soon as you can.
Yeah, so would you put a requirement on the type of ownership into the planning agreement?
No, I think by default you'll get those ownership types if you put those standards in.
I think, can I just say, I think inevitably we're going to see more and more an increase in requirements around I used the voice term, greenness of buildings, and we're already seeing Philip Hammond as Chancellor, surprisingly, rather than that housing, I can't remember what they call these things, housing communities, blah, blah, blah. But he's announced that within the next, I think, 10 years or so, he's actually rather less than that. We're not going to be allowed to have gas in new homes anymore because of issues to do with pollution in the house. But the consequences of that are we're going to have all electric homes. The consequences of that are that the house builders and developers and everybody else is going to be very conscious about how much it's going to cost to run those homes, and the consequences of that will be that we'll be back to Sustainable Homes Code 4 or 5. For those of you, does anybody know what I'm talking about? Which is what the Labour government had in place to try and up the quality of sort of environmental factors to do with housing and to reduce carbon emissions. So, I'm not sure that will then drive a change in tenure or time. The planning system can and does to some degree through Section 106 and the requirement for social, affordable housing. But actually, your theory, and I think it's a fantastic theory, which is that if you're going to own property for a long time, you're going to build it better, doesn't always work. And I think you simply have to look at some parts of the housing association world where the drive to build is, and the fact that there's very little grant around is having some impact on standards. I mean, I do think they're trying really hard. At the moment, we've got a government who is not investing very much in anything, and housing is fairly far down the line, and they are very interested in promoting home ownership because they broadly think that people who own their own homes have all right to vote for them. So, let's move on. Gentleman with the beard.
I'm a researcher at London policy, so I've been in London society for several years. My question is really directed to all of them. I carry a slightly touched on it already a little bit. It was about to what extent the kind of political appetite for community-led housing, how far it really goes. And I'm just kind of given the kind of intense financial pressure on local authorities and also housing targets, the alternative uses for large sites. I'm just quite interested in understanding how much they consider it a kind of easy way to tick off the small, really difficult sites we can't do anything else with, or has anyone actually taken a big count and said, okay, we're going to put this on something we could have either built kind of the new council housing or use for kind of alternative commercial uses?
I think, well, I mean, to go quite into the technical.
Let's take that. Hold it. Sorry. I broke way rules. Gentleman behind you, and then the gentleman in front of you.
My name's Phil. I'm doing a PhD in housing-related issues at the School of Architecture.
Yeah.
My question is about disposal of land that belongs to the states, whether it's the local authority or the NHS or the government itself. And obviously, the expectation is essentially it's our land that's being sold, and obviously I'm conscious that as somebody who maybe considers themselves part of the ownership of that, it obviously has to be sold for good value, doesn't it? Because you can't give the state's assets away. So how do you cope with that? I think particularly this must come up in your Croydon situations. Or how do you deal with balancing, the competing issue of getting that value and also the value of the thing that you're for whom you're kind of giving it away, or giving some of it away, or giving it to a much cheap price? How do you manage that?
Okay, and then.
My name is Richard Lee. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a planning consultant. I'm a community activist. And my question really is about, as you were raising, I think, in your last intervention, around maybe there's a need for more ambition. Maybe there's a context, a wider context that's changing. And I'm interested to hear from the speakers what would be the precise policy that they think would support and enable a significant scaling up of community-led housing. And it seems to me that, and maybe Gabby can say a bit more in her answer, that 20 years ago I was involved in a project looking at the United States and Community Land Trusts. 20 years ago, and we were looking at schemes there which were in the thousands, whether it was Vermont, New York, Boston, well-established schemes in the thousands, not 20 units here and there. And people like John Emmaus Davis, who I believe is still very active, what can we learn from how they did it to actually help us to imagine a policy for a change of government, which isn't a very pragmatic response, which a lot of the discussion's been about so far, but what would be the specific policy that we'd be putting forward to a government which may want to take a rather different approach?
Okay, so I think we've got two questions that kind of fall together, which is, we've got big sites, some of which are publicly owned. What do you do with them? What's the best value that you could get out of them? And what could we do to encourage public owners to think differently in an environment where I think particularly local authorities are so cash-strapped, which makes things really problematic. And of course, other government land is NHS Trust. They've got loads of money, haven't they? You know, so it's difficult, and most government is assuming that they're going to get capital receipts to prop up what they're doing. So, who would like to start?
I'll just say something brief. From the kind of cohousing experience, I think a lot of projects that actually don't go through and very quickly as they're imagining is because local authorities are turning down and saying, actually, how can we get the value that we need to get? So I think connected to the second question, there needs to be, yes, a radical kind of an ambition, and stated ambition that convinces the local authorities in a way that this is giving them the money. And to me, this has to do with using land for the community in the way that communities and residents are saying that needs to happen. So I think we end up always coming back to this kind of top-down version of how things need to be. And I think if we learn anything from Green Land Trust and from cohousing, is that it is these groups themselves that are often local, but not necessarily when they're saying what this land should be used for. That's not just about residential use, but actually mixed use developments. The other thing I wanted to kind of plug in there is that I think there needs to be much more government intervention in terms of professional support. I think part of the differences in some other European countries is that governments in the past have actually put the money in enabling a much more solid professional infrastructure than the one that exists here in construction, but also in terms of consultancy and what you described as happening in Croydon, with having professional developers kind of work with these groups so that this is happening at a wider scale and we can prove that these models actually work. And I think if that's not happening concurrently, the slowness of the thing will keep happening and we won't have the examples to show that this is a good thing.
Yeah. And then just to take the two questions at the same time, so are we doing any large sites? So local authorities, Croydon has had its capital, has had its budgets cut from central government by 75% since 2010. And we spent 80% of our revenue funding on our funding in general, on adult and children's social services. So our region, so important. It's really a tiny drop in the ocean compared to what we're actually doing. We're looking after vulnerable families, we're looking after vulnerable children, we're keeping people off the streets. We've got huge budget deficits, and we're actually using our land, brick by brick, are mainly doing plugging our revenue deficit. So we take money in as a council in two forms. We've got capital receipts, so capital income from land. So when we sell land brick by brick, they give money to us as a land receipt. We can only use that money for capital expenditure. So that's like other infrastructure projects, building stuff. We can't use that on adult and children's social care. So what we're doing brick by brick is we loan the money, and we can loan money at 1%. They borrow it from us at 6.5%. That 5.5% difference. That's millions of pounds over a few years. We're actually spending that on our adult and children's services. And then the third stream is profit. So they make, say, 20% profit on the private developments. We're using that profit stream to, again, plug our revenue gap. So when we run out of sites, I'm not quite sure what the plan is, but yeah. So from my argument, and this will come to sort of Phil and I's research, is that there really needs to be a long-term income stream from this kind of community-led housing. That's how we really scale it up. So at the moment, there's a lot of long-term finance in the market, as in like patient equity, pension funds looking for long-term investments. And if we can turn that into then long-term income coming back from these community groups, then I think that's where we can get this balance. So in terms of state land, this might sound a bit radical, but places like the city of Zurich has stopped selling state land. They only give it on long leases to community groups. And so they're getting that long-term income stream from community groups where they're paying for the land over the long term, and it's a kind of perpetual, well, it's pretty much perpetual, 100 years. And they're not, the Swiss are really doing this very matter-of-factly, they're really interested in the money as well. So they're actually not really doing it as kind of like some sort of, oh, it's so charitable and good. They're kind of, yeah, this makes financial sense, because not only are we getting the financial return over the long term, but they're also getting the social value, the community value, the design quality benefits, all of the things that we think are the additional benefits, but it also makes financial sense.
So before we go on to talk about what could a new government do to do something to make things different, I just think it's worth just reflecting on what Mark said about construction costs. And there are some quite interesting things which I know you yourself are doing about prefabrication, and for the first time, the governments have been talking about what they've called in the past modern methods of construction for at least 20 years. But I actually think we're now getting into a situation where prefabrication is now going to be something that will be a useful way of improving both quality but potentially also reducing costs. But along with all the other things that this government has cut, tragically, it's cut when you look at education. You may feel it's crap if you're a student, but my God, if you want to go to further education, college and do bricklaying, that's where they really, really cut education costs. So we've gone from the situation where we had a skill shortage in the construction industry for many, many years, and the reaction of the current government was to reduce the opportunity to train more, and the new apprenticeship scheme that they brought in is also actually perversely reducing the number of apprenticeships, not just in the building industry, but across the piece. And as the daughter of somebody who set up a building company, which is still going really rather well, I can tell you the profit we make on construction is something like 2 to 3%. So somewhere or other, somebody in the construction industry is making lots of money, but I don't think it's people who are actually at the front end of construction. I think it's slightly a mystery to me, but I absolutely agree with your figures. So can we now perhaps think about what, if we were a new government coming in, this is the four of us, and I'm sure it would be absolutely fantastic, and it would be a much nicer place. And we were just wanting to try and tackle just the housing thing rather than all the other things that have been done badly. So let's start off with you, Gabrielle. What would you do to promote more people-led housing?
Well, I guess I think there are many things that need to be done, as Melissa said in her presentations, a series of policies. I think there needs to be more regulation of the financial markets. There needs to be, I think, a reallocation of sources of money, because, and here's coming back to the question of value for money, and if we just look at a small-scale project, which is Rose, they are cross-subsidizing. They got no funding for social rented homes, and they're cross-subsidizing for 5 social rented homes within a 33 unit scheme. This is definitely value for money if I could give that opinion. So I think that it's knowing how we are spending public money and reallocating this public money, because a lot of public money is used to subsidize profit-making schemes that don't cater to the needs of local people.
Yeah, I think basically the government should be investing more in schemes that are co-housing right. It doesn't have to be co-housing specifically, and I think they should be mixed tenure. And similarly, by enabling mixed tenure, what you're doing is you're really putting in social housing, which we know has been going down and down and down for decades. So I think co-housing needs to be part of a new and much improved and much accelerated provision of social housing. And there's examples right now, especially in Italy, where that is taking place with the help of government. And so I think we just need to look a little bit further afield and those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I'd sort of say, echoing these guys, it's about, this supply-side subsidy of potentially of land, but it could be in terms of these long-term income streams. When Phil, once you've done that PhD, maybe we solve the housing crisis, I don't know, but there's really something about tying up all this money that's sloshing around in terms of these pension funds with this sort of desire to create good places. It's a bit like thinking back to the great estates, these really long-term landowners who look over hundreds of years. It makes perfect sense for them to invest lots of money in their streets and their shops and their homes, and I think that's hopefully what scaling up the community-led housing sector could look like in this country.
If I could just put my 2 penny with it, when I started out refurbishing housing for housing associations, we were getting a subsidy of about 95%. So we were buying street properties and doing them up for social rent, and we got a subsidy of 95%. We're now at a subsidy of, what, 20% of the option? And, you know, that accounts for quite a significant impact on our ability in the public sector and the not-for-profit sector to build more homes. And I think, and it also accounts for the enormous growth in housing benefit costs. And if, you know, what would be the most amazing thing would be if we could get agreement amongst the political parties about a future model for providing housing of all tenures in this country. Because what we do is we flip-flop back and forwards, and it's difficult for any part of the house building process to provide sort of a long-term solutions, because every time the government changes, you get a different subsidy system. And I think that's very fundamental. And that takes us to